You're in charge of the return.
Okay, well, I'm very pleased to introduce, this is Ken Smith. I'm the System-Wide Laboratory Safety Manager and will be the moderator for today's presentation. And I'm very pleased to introduce on the webinar with me today two other colleagues from the faculty at UCLA. Joining us today we have Dr. Craig Merlick, who is an Associate Professor of the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry, and Dr. Nancy Wayne, who is the co-chair for the Center for Laboratory Safety and the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research at UCLA. Craig and Nancy, welcome very much to today's webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so welcome everybody to Wear Your Lab Coat, Changes in UCLA's PPE Policy, and how researchers responded. So both Craig Merlick and I are principal investigators of laboratories. I've been at UCLA for a little over 20 years as the PI of a physiology laboratory in the Department of Physiology at the David Geffen School of Medicine at UCLA. And in 2010, I was appointed as Associate Vice Chancellor for Research with the Lab Safety portfolio. And this was a new position at UCLA, and it's a unique position at any of the UC campuses. And it was in response to an accident that we are going to be talking about pretty soon that led to changes throughout our entire lab safety program, and also with the way that we deal with personal protective equipment. And I'll now hand it over to Craig Merlick.
I'm a professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at UCLA, and I have been involved with safety throughout my career. I've been on the Laboratory Safety Committee in my department for many years, and in 2008 I became chair of that committee, and 28 days later was the terrible accident at UCLA. So I've been, since then, very intimately involved in a number of things going on in my department. I've also been involved with the campus-based Laboratory Safety Committee, and we'll talk about that a little bit later today. And I've been also active as a instructor, creator of a course in laboratory safety in my department. The course is titled Safety in Chemical and Biochemical Research. So let's go ahead and get started today.
Okay, so just want to go through very briefly an outline of our discussion. We have a lot of territory to cover, even though it's on one topic, PPE. It's a big one. So we're going to go through a history of UCLA's PPE policy, and we will then go through the policy itself, policy number 905, implementation of the policy, the relation of our campus policy to what's in the settlement agreement between the Los Angeles District Attorney and the UC Regents, which impacts all 10 UC campuses. And we'll go through a history of what that was all about. Challenges of the PPE policy, especially in terms of implementation. Our researchers and principal investigators, did they get on board with this policy, and are they compliant with it? And then the outcomes of this policy. So, what are the real impacts of this policy on researchers' behaviors?
So to start things off, let's just take a little bit of a historical background. And so these are some early chemistry laboratories, and you'll notice the alchemists at work here in a general disheveled appearance of both the researchers and the laboratory. You also will notice a certain predilection for experiments in fire, although you'll notice that the lab assistants on the researchers left are a little concerned about the fire going on there in this early laboratory painting. And as time went on, things improved a little bit. You'll notice now that they've invented hoods, but still the labs are rather disheveled in appearance, and safety PPE attire is not present. But you also will notice.
Okay, so we've got this animal, a vertebrate, hanging from the ceiling. It may be alive or not, but this is a serious IACUC violation, that's for sure. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee would have problems with this and the dog in the laboratory. That's an issue as well.
Right. So time moved on, and then about 100 years ago, laboratories looked like this, and much improved image of the laboratory, a lot more organization, but PPE is still not really present in these laboratories.
This is actually a photo of my grandfather. He was a medical student in 1920, and this is him in the gross anatomy lab. So here is the preserved cadaver that he was working on, and it's preserved with formaldehyde, which is a highly hazardous chemical. He was wearing a lab coat, so in 1920 they had instituted lab coats in gross anatomy labs, but no gloves. All right, this is kind of nasty. And even today, a lot of the students don't have to wear eye protection. It really depends on how much liquid is surrounding the cadaver. Some of them are fairly dry. Some of them are sitting in preservatives. So.
Okay, interesting. So moving forward to the current era, so here is a modern laboratory. So this is a nice photo from the University of Kansas Center of Excellence in Chemical Methodologies. And you can see the laboratory has nice shiny new hoods, and it looks like there's some chemistry going on. And we see here a researcher, so either a graduate student or a postdoctoral researcher, and he's wearing the typical academic safety attire of 2005. So he's wearing his gloves and eye protection and a T-shirt. But all that changed in December 29th of 2008. So this woman, Sherry Sangji, was doing this chemistry shown here in the middle. And one of the reagents she was using was tertiary butyllithium, and that's shown here in the bottle. And that chemical is exceedingly pyrophoric. When exposed to air, it immediately bursts into flames. She was working in this hood shown here on the lower right, and she was using a syringe showing in the upper right. And accidentally, she pulled the plunger out of the barrel of the syringe, exposing this highly pyrophoric material to air, and it burst into flames. And it unfortunately caught her clothing on fire, and she was severely burned over 40% of her body. And she died 18 days later from this tragic accident. Now, when people started to investigate the accident, a number of factors came to light. So possibly the experiment design played a role, the experimental techniques that were used, the synthetic clothing that she was wearing. So she was wearing a synthetic shirt that caught fire, and that contributed to the burns on her torso. And her training was questioned, but a major role that people felt played a factor that was a major role was the PPE. So she was not wearing a lab coat at the time, and the lab coat that she had available was actually not a flame-resistant lab coat. And so question is, how much did the lack of PPE contribute to her burns? We see in the picture here a researcher working under hazardous, lack of PPE, and then the safe on the right side. And so we'll be talking more about that during the presentation. So looking at the timeline.
Okay, so what we're going to go through is the timeline of events that impacted UCLA, but also the UC system in general, starting from the date of the accident. It's nearly 4 years ago. Sherry died about 2 weeks after the lab accident. She died from her very severe burn injuries. And in January, Cal OSHA did its lab inspections, and in those initial inspections, there were some fines based on noncompliance that they found in the laboratory. And then there were additional inspections, complaints about lab coats, proper sizing of lab coats, which became an issue throughout our campus, but especially in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. There were further investigations and new investigations of the lab accident, and which actually led to the district attorney, I'm going to point down here, in December of 2011 filing felony charges against not only the regents of the entire UC system, but also the PI who was Sherry Sangji's boss for willful violation of safety regulations. Okay, felony charges, extremely serious, with huge implications for you know, the health and well-being of the UC system. But
that's also a significant event in legal history, because it turns out that a professor has never been charged in this way before. So it's new legal ground for the Los Angeles District Attorney.
Right, and had implications in ways that the district attorney had never really foreseen until it was brought to their attention. So moving back up to February 2010, that was when UCLA issued Policy 905 on PPE use in laboratories. And this became really the foundation for the huge section on PPE that was in the settlement agreement between the UC Regents and the LA District Attorney, and we'll go into more details about that. I'm sorry, I've lost my little arrow here. There it is. Okay, so we went through this. There were more lab coat citations in February 2010. Cal OSHA had been inspecting the chemistry department fairly regularly after this inspection, and every time they came out, they found something that was not in compliance, what they felt were part of their regulations.
I actually participated in those Cal OSHA inspections. So there were about 3 or 4 people from Cal OSHA. I represented the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry at UCLA, and they went to several different labs, inspecting the labs. They interviewed students one-on-one. So it basically was an all-day and very thorough inspection. It began in the morning with a conference between Cal OSHA and the people on site, and then concluded at the end of the day with a conference where Cal OSHA presented their findings.
Right. Then in March, Cal OSHA had a further citation. This IIPP stands for Illness and Injury Prevention Program, and so they had an incident reporting on that. I have to be very honest with you. Back in March 2010, I can tell you that very few principal investigators or chairs of department knew what an IIPP was. That has now changed. We all know what that is now. We went through what happened in December 2011, and then just recently this year in July, the UC Regents signed a settlement agreement terminating prosecution against the Regents of the University of California. However, as of today, there are still ongoing legal issues for the PI, Professor Haran. Okay, so the aftermath of this accident was quite profound. Repercussions across the entire campus and the entire University of California system. Chemistry departments and universities across the nation have been paying attention to this. That's why you're all here to get more information, because you've been paying attention to this as well.
Yes. And as we've traveled around the nation, people are constantly asking us about what is going on at UCLA, but also how to be in compliance with OSHA regulations and what they should be doing.
So questions that come out of discussions with our colleagues and health and safety experts resulting from the aftermath of the accident is, you know, what changed at UCLA? Where did it change? How did it change? When did it change? Who changed in terms of their behavior? Why did they change their behavior? And today we'll be focusing primarily on PPE.
Right. So we mentioned the Cal OSHA inspections, and then there were 3 different fines. And so here are just the first page screenshots of the actual fines that were given to UC and the department, and specifically the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry. And so within each of these, there were we were cited for several different things. But in the first one, citation number 1 was for a lack of personal protective equipment, and in the second fine, there was a citation number 3 for bodily protection. So these are specific things that had come up. So it's important to recognize what is existing law. So the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 29, Part 1910, Subpart 1 on PPE specifically outlines the requirements, and it's a long sentence, but it's important that everyone recognize all the details here. So protective equipment, including personal protective equipment for eyes, face, head, and extremities, protective clothing, respiratory devices, and protective shields and barriers shall be provided, used, and maintained in a sanitary and reliable condition wherever it is necessary by reason of hazards of process or environment, chemical hazards, radiological hazards, or mechanical irritants encountered in a manner capable of causing injury or impairment in the function of any part of the body through absorption and inhalation or physical contact. So that's quite a mouthful for one sentence, but clearly lays out all the different areas that we have to consider when thinking about PPE.
So one of the problems that we face as principal investigators and researchers is that we don't go around reading Code of Federal Regulations. I never heard of Title 29, Part 1910. And so we really rely on our campus's health and safety experts to provide us with this information. The challenge is that the regulations are constantly changing. It is a moving target, and our experts have a challenge in keeping up with the changes and then relaying that to the PIs and the researchers.
Another important point is that in several different federal regulations regarding safety, it actually does not prescribe what specific things you must have. So you'll notice that it says protective equipment, and it says protecting the eyes, head, face, extremities, but it doesn't tell you what. And then it says in the event of exposure to chemical hazards or radiological hazards, but it doesn't say what hazards or what levels. So there's actually a fair degree of ambiguity here in that, what is required. And so the federal regulations basically specify that you have to have protection, but it doesn't specify exactly what the protection should be. The same thing goes through for some other areas of safety. For example, toxic things. They don't necessarily give you on a federal OSHA website what chemicals are considered to be acutely toxic, but instead they give some definitions of what an acutely toxic compound is, and then it's up to the researchers to find out whether those things fit into that category. So it's important that researchers get advice from EH&S, but also use their individual expertise in this area.
Okay, so we're going to spend some time talking specifically about UCLA's PPE policy. We'll discuss who created it, a timeline for creation and approval, where it applies, who does it apply to, what exactly is covered, the specific contents, and some revisions that will be coming up, and why those revisions are important.
So to jump right into it, here's the details of starting it out.
Okay, so this policy was created by a laboratory safety committee, a campus committee, that was brought together immediately following the accident that led to the death of Sherry Sanji. And this is required for all campus research laboratory faculty, staff, and students. Anybody who walks into a laboratory has got to follow and be in compliance with Policy 905. It was issued as an official policy through the Chancellor's Office on February 10th, 2010.
An important point is the Laboratory Safety Committee, and here's some details about that. Okay,
so the Lab Safety Committee was created by the Chancellor, and it's under the direction of the Vice Chancellor for Research. But this is really important. This is a faculty-led committee. It's chaired by a faculty member. I am one of the co-vice chairs of the committee. And then the director of our Office of Environment, Health, and Safety is the other co-vice chair. But it's really dominated by faculty. In addition to the faculty who have an interest and a stake in lab safety, we have 4 EH&S representatives. The Vice Chancellor for Research sits on the meetings, and as I said before, me, the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research with Lab Safety Oversight, also plays a role in that. And the operation of the Lab Safety Committee is parallel to our existing committees on radiation safety and biosafety.
Which are important parallels because federal law effectively mandates the Radiation Safety Committee and the Biosafety Committee, and so those committees were in existence for quite some time, but the Laboratory Safety Committee is a new committee. And a key point that I want to point out is the importance of having faculty on this, because the committee has oversight over all the researchers on campus, and to make sure that there's buy-in by the faculty and respect by the faculty of the committee and its decisions, it's important that there be significant faculty membership on this committee. In terms of specific membership, at UCLA we have a number of schools, so there are 2 people from the School of Medicine, someone from the School of Dentistry, 2 people from the School of Engineering, a number of people from the College of Letters and Science, and so it truly is a campus-wide committee representing the various interests.
Okay, so this Lab Safety Committee, like we said before, they were the ones that developed, or we were the ones that developed the PPE policy. Craig is also an active member of that committee. But just generally, what it is that the charge of Lab Safety Committee is to develop, recommend, and update policies on health and safety of lab workers. So the PPE policy was one of those. Receive and review summary reports from EH&S on lab inspections, and those lab inspections, of course, include PPE inspections. Receive and review reports from departmental and faculty health and safety committees. We have those. Establish strategies to ensure surveillance, hazard identification, and risk evaluation of lab activities. Review communication of responsibilities and accountability for lab safety and incidents across campus. We review the campus safety programs annually. And we coordinate with biosafety, radiation safety, and the School of Medicine safety committees. So the Lab Safety Committee, really, its main focus is on chemical safety. But we also have biosafety and radiation safety committees, so we coordinate with those other committees. And the Lab Safety Committee advises the Chancellor and the Executive Vice Chancellor regarding compliance with campus safety policies.
And most federal and state laws have a primary focus on health safety issues, but it's also important to recognize that chemical safety and chemical exposure can lead to problems other than internal health. But there are also things like physical hazards. So a fire is a physical hazard. Lasers and loud noises and cold temperatures, hot temperatures are physical hazards. And so the Laboratory Safety Committee is going to be reviewing all these other areas and how PPE can prevent injuries from workers due to physical hazards in addition to chemical hazards.
Okay, so who is responsible for what in terms of implementation and compliance with the PPE policy? So at UCLA, we feel very strongly that the message, overall message regarding lab safety starts at the top with the Chancellor. Our Chancellor happens to be the PI of a biomedical laboratory, so he gets it. Everything that we do at UCLA personally impacts him. He has to do all the lab safety training. He has to wear PPE when he goes into his laboratory. He's an active PI of a federally funded laboratory. So he has overall responsibility for compliance with health and safety on the campus, and the Vice Chancellor for Research is responsible for the implementation of the PPE policy. The Lab Safety Committee is responsible for promoting a working environment in which all research and teaching laboratories are impacted on our campus. The department chairs are responsible for communicating, promoting, and enforcing the policy in their respective research and teaching areas. And I have to say, being in the medical school, it's the largest school on campus. Department chairs, their involvement in PPE policy and lab safety is highly variable. Some are, on board, and some don't really want to get involved. So it's highly variable. Really, it all comes down to the PI and lab supervisor. They are ultimately responsible for everything that goes on in the lab. They're responsible for complying with the PPE policy and ensuring their staff receive appropriate training and comply with this policy. Now, there's a law in California that's been dubbed "Be a Manager or Go to Jail." PIs were not aware of this. They're still not aware of this. They're shocked when I talk about this law. We as PIs don't really view ourselves as being managers. We view ourselves as being scientists. And it just so happens that we have to manage people in order to do our science. So it's a very different way of looking at things, and not something that a lot of PIs signed up for, and it's now the job that we have. I don't know, Craig, if you got a different perspective from chemistry.
No, that point is being driven home in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry because Professor Heron is still facing ongoing legal action where the district attorney wants to hold him responsible for Sherry's accident. And so it really is true that, be a manager and go to jail. And so we're doing everything we can to work with Professor Heron, because we don't feel that he's should go to jail over this incident, and it would be a very unusual precedent for research nationwide.
Right. Lab research staff, including undergraduate, graduate students, and postdocs, all trainees, are responsible for following lab safety requirements and for wearing PPE as outlined in this policy and in laboratory-specific safety training. Now, I can tell you from running my own laboratory, where shorts and flip-flops were not unusual, women wearing skirts and dresses and showing a lot of skin, this was tough. And, I'm supposed to be the lab safety czar, and getting my people on board with this PPE was a tough sell. I told them that they had no choice, they had to do it, but I am not a full-time babysitter in my laboratory. And when I would just walk into the lab unannounced, they didn't know I was coming, they weren't all following the PPE policy. It took about a year to get them on board with this.
Yeah, we'll show you data as this presentation goes on, but it's absolutely true that you need to have the PIs have the responsibility for monitoring their researchers. But having so many people on campus talk about this, we have people from EH&S coming by, we have the chancellor talking about it, we have the department chairs talking about it, and the people at the ground level are being barraged all the time about the importance of PPE, and we have been able to have a dramatic change in PPE at UCLA.
Right. We actually have data on this that we'll go through at the end, because that's what, researchers like to see data. And then finally, very importantly, the UCLA Office of Environment, Health, and Safety is responsible for inspections of laboratory and enforcement of this policy, and they play a critical role in this whole implementation.
Right. So what is exactly the policy?
Okay, so there's a lot here, and we'll have 3 slides of this policy. First of all, and this is something new and different for people in Southern California, full-length pants or equivalent and closed-toed shoes must be worn at all times by all individuals that are occupying the lab area. Protective gloves must be worn while utilizing any hazardous chemical, biological, or unsealed radiological material. Lab coats or equivalent are required to be worn while working on or adjacent to all benchtop procedures utilizing hazardous chemicals, biological, or unsealed radiological materials.
So as she pointed out, we are in Southern California, so getting compliance in the first point has taken some effort. But over about a year, we were able to have dramatic changes in behaviors of graduate students and postdoctoral researchers and staff researchers in this area. It's been very effective. I also want to point out that one challenge that we've encountered is, what constitutes adjacent to. So in my chemistry labs, the student office area is separate from the laboratory itself, and it's separated by a glass wall, so we can see into the lab, but students can be working at their desk and not wearing PPE.
But that's not the case in my laboratory, and the typical, more modern laboratory is designed so that you have a desk at the end of each research bench, and that's how it is throughout the medical school. So that means that you could be, as a student, let's say, working on a manuscript, but the person who is at that bench right next to you is working with a highly hazardous chemical. So you, as the person who is not doing the experiment, have to wear the same PPE, okay, but not gloves, but the same PPE as the person doing the experiment next to you.
And so this might lead to some changes in laboratory design so that people can have separation, at least to some degree, between their desk and the bench area.
Okay, flame-resistant laboratory coats must be worn when working with pyrophoric materials or large amounts of flammable materials, greater than 4 liters of those flammable liquids. And Craig, do you want to comment on that?
So I was actually involved in writing this policy, and so at the time that we were writing this in early 2010, late 2009, everyone pretty much had white lab coats in chemistry labs, and I know the biomedical researchers have white lab coats. And so it seemed like an extra burden to move to a flame-resistant laboratory coat. And so we wrote this in as greater than 4 liters because sort of the standard bottle is the brown 4-liter bottle, and that's 4 liters. So under these rules, then you could wear a normal white lab coat. However, since this time, we've become aware that there have been a number of fires around the nation where biomedical researchers were doing, say, sterilization procedures where they use a Bunsen burner, a loop, and ethanol to do bacterial research. And they've ended up catching themselves on fire because they knock over the ethanol Erlenmeyer flask in the presence of the Bunsen burner. So it actually seems to be a hazard down to, say, as little as 100 milliliters. So the committee, the Laboratory Safety Committee, is actually looking at revising this PPE policy such that this first bullet point is going to be going down to 100 milliliters. And in chemistry, we actually threw away all our white lab coats because it turns out that during a Cal OSHA inspection, the inspector said, do you have a policy and procedure in place so that researchers know when to wear the white lab coat and when to wear the blue flame-resistant lab coats? And so I thought about it for about 3 seconds and said, yes, we have a policy in our department. We're throwing away all the white lab coats, and we're only using the blue flame-resistant laboratory coats in chemistry in my department. So that's how we dealt with that.
This is going to be an extremely hard sell in medical school. White lab coats means physician, or that you are training physicians. And so it'll be very interesting to see if we can make this work in the medical school. I think we'll get a lot of pushback. So,
yep.
Yeah. Okay. Here's something that's been very difficult, especially in the medical school. Lab coats may not be worn outside of a laboratory unless the individual is traveling directly to an adjacent lab work area. Again, we have many clinician scientists. They wear their lab coats to see patients. They wear those same lab coats when they go into their lab. They wear those same lab coats when they go to the cafeteria. They wear those same lab coats when they walk into Westwood Village to go shopping. Those lab coats are their uniform, and they wear them everywhere. So that's something that we tried to change. I think in chemistry they've got that message, but not in the medical school.
Yeah.
Each department or research unit shall be responsible for providing professional laundry services as needed to maintain the hygiene of lab coats. That means that no longer can the people in my lab take their lab coats home and throw them in the wash with their panties. That cannot happen anymore. And they are not responsible for paying for this service.
Yeah. It's actually a law that you cannot have the employees buy PPE, nor can they be paying for maintenance of the PPE. So each department set up a pickup with the local laundry service to clean these lab coats, and it's not any laundry service. It has to be a special laundry service that can deal with laboratory coats.
Okay, eye protection or equivalent engineering controls have to be used while handling any hazardous chemical, biological, or unsealed radiological materials. And then some operations and procedures may warrant further PPE as indicated by the material safety data sheet, the standard operating procedures for the material being used, facility policies and regulatory requirements, or the EH&S lab hazard assessment tool that Craig will be going through fairly soon. That's something that UCLA EH&S developed. So, you know, some of those further PPE could be a lead apron if you're working with I-125 or a respirator, things like that.
Right. And for eye protection, I think in chemistry, we've had requirements for eye protection for a long time, for decades. And so we have no problem with that. But I think in the biomedical areas, eye protection is probably, in some areas, a newer required item.
It's completely new. It really is. So most labs will have the eye goggles, eye protection, and they're just not being used. But that is changing.
Right. And regarding that last bullet point, again, related to what I said a few minutes ago, that it's important that the PIs evaluate the situation, and if there are other types of PPE that are warranted, then they need to make sure that those are available to the employees. Regarding the hazards.
Okay, so people wonder what's constitutes a hazardous material. So here's the list: any unsealed radioactive material, biological materials in the biosafety level BSL 2 category or greater, chemicals listed as select carcinogens and regulated carcinogens, chemicals listed as reproductive toxins, chemicals listed as toxic or highly toxic, flammable chemicals in excess of 1 liter by volume, and again that may change, or any amount of violently air-active or water-reactive chemicals, corrosive chemicals in the concentration of 1 molar or greater, and any chemical known to have significant skin or eye irritant properties.
And regarding flammable chemicals, it's important to recognize that most organic chemicals are combustible, but the flammable has a specific OSHA definition, and that's with a flash point less than or equal to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So most solvents, small alcohols like methanol, ethanol, are all flammable chemicals, and so people need to consider these materials as hazardous.
Okay, so the types of PPE, we've touched upon this. They include, lab coats, the correct type of lab coat, depending on what type of research that you're doing and what type of hazard you'll be in contact with. Eye protection. You need to make decisions about not just whether or not to wear gloves, but what type of glove, what kind of material to use, depending on what it is that you're working with. Craig and I were just discussing what do you do about gloves if you're working with highly flammable material, because if it splashes, if something ignites and it splashes on your hands, wearing gloves that would melt to your skin could make things much worse than just being barehanded. So there's some decisions that have to be made there. Respiratory protection. So here you see 2 researchers. They're in a vivarium, and they're wearing masks to probably both ways, to protect the animals from them and them from the animals. So allergens are a big issue when you're working in a vivarium.
On the subject of respirators, it turns out at UCLA, if people are trained for respirators, then they actually need to have annual retraining of the respirators. And so that's an added burden on maintaining the training for PPE for the researchers. So there are simple dust masks like seen in the picture here, but then more formal respirators that have filters, and so those require maintenance of the respirator itself and annual retraining of the researcher.
Right. Anybody who is working in a BSL-3 or beyond facility has got to wear full body protection from head to toe that has air intake that goes into it. So it's these PPEs can be quite costly, and so there's the issue of cost and subsidies of PPE. The researchers do not bear the brunt of the cost of PPE. You cannot tell your technician to go out and buy a lab coat off of their funds. It has to come from somewhere. In the medical school right now, it's coming out of the principal investigators' research funds as lab equipment or lab supplies. Some departments are subsidizing this, so it's really done on a department-by-department basis.
What we did in the Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry is, since we were switching from white lab coats for chemistry to the blue flame-resistant lab coats, we actually bought several hundred at one lot and then sold them internally, and so we were actually able to somewhat subsidize the cost of that for the faculty.
Mm-hmm. So Craig, could you comment on sources of PPE? Because in the medical school, it's a grab bag. People just get them from whatever source is the cheapest. Yeah. Without any really, discussion of quality.
Yeah, that's true in chemistry. I think when it came to the flame-resistant lab coats, I actually did research into where they're available, what were the costs, and could we minimize the charges to the faculty. But beyond that, it's up to individual PIs to source their own PPE, although departments can help by buying certain things and stocking them internally.
Right.
But we'd like to move on to LHAT as a PPE tool. And so the question is, what is LHAT? So LHAT is the laboratory hazard assessment tool created by the UCLA H&S. And it's essentially a tool to help labs identify what hazards they have in their labs and then what are the applicable PPE. So it's a totally online feature. It's a very nice system. And here's the opening page here. But if we move forward, on this laboratory hazard assessment tool. It basically its purpose is to assess potential hazards, quantify risk levels, specify PPE according to a risk-based assessment, and then verify PPE training and do data collection. And shown here is the opening slide of that. And it tailors the PPE by assessing the hazards according to the activity, the hazards, the applicable PPE, and it quantifies the risk level by types of hazards and the quantities of materials. So what this actually looks like is shown here. So there's a series of pages, and this is only a small portion screenshot of those pages. So under biological hazards, it says there's an activity such as working with human blood or human bodily tissues or bloodborne pathogens, and then what is the potential hazard, and then the applicable PPE is shown. So this form then allows researchers, in particular the PIs, to walk down a long list of different activities and to identify the hazards within their labs. So there's biological hazards, there's chemical hazards, and you can see that it talks about corrosive liquids there, and also identifies the volume and then the applicable PPE, and then radiological hazards, laser hazards, physical hazards, and then not shown is nanomaterial hazards. And so this has multiple functions, so it allows the PIs to assess what hazards are present, what PPE is required. It also serves as a useful tool for our EH&S because the PIs fill it out saying what hazards they have in their labs, and then it allows EH&S to return and inspect the laboratories based on the known hazards in the lab, so that allows them to know what type of PPE they should be looking for. So it's a really nice tool for use by both EH&S and individual research groups.
Another tool that we have available to us is the standard operating procedures, and in the SOPs that are used at UCLA is information about PPE.
And so we're required to write SOPs, and here's a screenshot from an instruction page. But a key part of it is that personal protective equipment must be identified for a particular hazardous material or operation and specified in terms of exposure and quantities and all the different aspects.
Okay, and then finally, there's an issue about clothing. In addition to long pants and closed-toed shoes, if you're working with pyrophorics or flammables, there's now a requirement to wear non-synthetic clothing underneath your lab coats.
So the tragic accident with Sherry Sanji, she was wearing a synthetic shirt that led to burns on her body. Another issue is laundering. We mentioned that, so it must be done by a professional laundering service. And then tailoring. So we were actually asked questions by Cal OSHA about some lab coats that were being worn by some rather small researchers. And so we had to set up formal tailoring so that the coats would not present a hazard floppy material. And again, the individual student or researcher cannot be responsible for that cost.
Okay, so the UCLA response in terms of the settlement agreement, which impacted all 10 campuses, was so what was in that? So there were really 5 major points. One was acceptance of responsibility for what happened in the Department of Chemistry at UCLA, establishment of a Sherry Sanji Scholarship at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, agreement to pay all Cal OSHA costs, implementation of specific lab safety practices, which includes a huge section on PPE, and certification of compliance semi-annually for 4 years.
So the large section is actually the 4th bulleted item on specific laboratory practices. So outlined in the agreement with the district attorney are 12 specific points, and these are shown over these 3 slides regarding what we must do at UCLA. And the requirement is between all departments of chemistry and or biochemistry in the University of California system. And so you can see the specific things here regarding lab safety manual, chemical hygiene plan, PI training, lab personnel training, SOP procedures, procedures for use of pyrophoric reagents, PPE assessment by each principal investigator. So this is a specific requirement, and so the LHAT is exceedingly useful for meeting this requirement because it allows this assessment to be made. And then there's a long section of multiple points regarding PPE that we have to comply with. And so there's going to be inspections by Cal OSHA to see that we are following the requirements of the settlement agreement, and also the university has to certify twice a year that we're meeting the requirements of the settlement agreement. But you can see that PPE plays a key role in this. Now, we haven't yet talked about PPE monitoring or documentation, but we're going to be getting to that next. And then the last 4 points with the settlement agreement deals with the enhanced EHS inspections internally, enhanced Cal OSHA inspections, enhanced Cal OSHA reporting, and investigations. And so Cal OSHA will be coming by. They haven't come by yet, but we expect them anytime. And if we were to unfortunately have another accident, it would be treated potentially as a crime scene. So that's why there would be enhanced investigations. Hopefully that will not happen. Okay, challenges of the PPE policy. So there are many issues that come up when considering this, and so just to explain the picture here, if you have visitors to the lab, they also have to comply with the PPE policy. So you'll notice here there's a picture of Jennifer Aniston, and she is touching some object that a researcher is holding, but you'll notice the researcher is wearing gloves while he holds that object, and he's wearing a white lab coat, and he has safety glasses on. And so this is clearly a violation that she is not wearing appropriate PPE for the situation. That's that picture. We mentioned PPE outside the labs, and in chemistry and biochemistry, we were pretty good about that, that the students are not wearing them. We even had to issue special directives regarding transport of chemicals. So if people are transporting the waste or reagent chemicals outside the lab, the chemicals have to be bottled for transport, and then that does not require PPE to be worn outside of the lab. But documentation is a big change, and so in the academic environment, forever, we pretty much had safety glasses and coats and gloves available for students, but we didn't exactly document it. But it turns out that the situation has changed. And so this is faculty-student mentoring 1,000 years ago, and the faculty member talks to his disciples. And then 1,000 years after that, it's pretty much the same thing. The faculty members talk to their students, and there's not a lot of written documentation. But that has now changed, and so this is faculty-student mentoring in 2012, where we're required to have documentation of all the activities related to safety. So in the specific area of student mentoring now, we have to have PPE training that's lab-specific, and the faculty must document that training with written records that are kept. Written records must be kept of issuing of PPE to researchers. We have to document PPE recommendations within process SOPs and chemical SOPs so that we have a record of what students should be wearing when doing research. So as an example of a form that faculty must fill out with their students is shown here. So this is a PPE record. So at the top you can see my name, Craig Merlick, and then the employee would fill out their name and their university ID number, and then they would answer the question saying that they've been trained in the use of this PPE, and they have to sign and date it. And then shown at the bottom is the type of PPE that's issued in my lab. So flame-resistant lab coat, safety glasses, safety goggles, disposable gloves, beauty gloves. The size, if appropriate, whether it's a shared item or not. Some safety items in my lab are shared, such as blast shields and low-temperature and high-temperature gloves. Then the employee needs to sign and date it that they've been trained on these various PPE that they can use. Another form that faculty have to keep records on is discussions of PPE. So in group meeting, we discuss safety all the time. And so when we did have these discussions, I send this form around where we write out what was discussed and who was in charge and the date, and then the employees sign and date this, indicating that they've been trained for safety.
Okay, so the next two items, enforcement and inspections. So really the PI and environment, health, and safety are responsible for enforcing the PPE policy, and the inspections are done by inspectors in the Office of Environment, Health, and Safety. And so this used to not happen, that we had PPE inspections, and then things changed, and there was a huge expansion of the UCLA lab inspection checklist that inspectors from EH&S now use. And so the inspections are much more uniform, they're much more expanded, and PPE is a big part of the inspection.
So shown here is just the opening page from the inspection reports, and it's now an 8-page report, and EHS is inspecting over 3,700 labs, rooms at UCLA. And the inspection checklist includes many different items, but PE definitely plays a prominent role in the inspection form, along with training records. And the PPE would not only include that people are wearing it when the inspectors walk in the room, but also that there are records of the issuance of PPE and the training for the PPE. I should also point out that our inspectors have PhD degrees, and so they are respected by the researchers that they're coming to visit. And I think that's a helpful thing that our EHS has done at UCLA. Then at the after inspections, there are reports that are given out to the labs that are inspected, and critical violations are re-inspected after 48 hours, and then thereafter every 24 hours. And so violations of PPE are considered a critical violation, and so they must be corrected immediately. Reports after the inspections are sent out to the PI and department chair, and if things are not corrected, after 30 days it goes up to the divisional dean, and after 60 days it goes up to my colleague here today, Nancy Wayne, the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research, who then can contact the PIs to make sure that they're dealing with fixing the violations in the lab.
Right, I make the phone call. It's a very uncomfortable conversation people have with me. Okay, so EH&S has got a challenge. Are they friend or foe? And you can imagine that as these inspections ramped up, that they were looked upon as being the safety police. So Professor Ken Bradley, in an email, stated specifically, as I read the policy now with my PI perspective, and this is the chair of the Lab Safety Committee, and he's also a PI of a lab, it not only reinforces EH&S as a policing entity out to punish and not to be trusted, but it weakens the credibility of the Lab Safety Committee as it aligns us with this policing mentality. I would much prefer that EH&S and the Lab Safety Committee be seen as partners in promoting lab safety. Okay, this was something that was sent out by James Gibson, director of UCLA EH&S, a different perspective. In addition to scheduled lab safety inspections, we also conduct PPE compliance inspections, unannounced lab safety inspections, and level A hazard inspections. While it is not our intention to be the police, we do have an obligation to record observations of serious safety issues if they are outside the scope of the above referenced inspections. What this means is that the EH&S inspectors cannot be used, okay, as a consulting experts. They come into the lab, they see something, they write it up.
Right. And so this is the challenge that I think EH&S people around the system need to work as hard as they can to be colleagues in safety compliance, although recognizing their role of inspecting and holding labs to certain standards.
So as we're getting close to the closing hour here, just want to say a few points about the newly implemented, as of August 30th, 2010, unannounced PPE inspections. This photo was taken at the very first inspection and involved me, the Chancellor of UCLA, the Dean of Physical Sciences, the Director of EH&S, and several EH&S inspectors. So what we saw in 2010, after less than 6 months, okay, of these unannounced inspections of 183 lab groups inspected, was that only 60% of the lab groups were compliant. Now, this is everyday behavior, real behavior in a laboratory. I look at 60%, and I'm thinking, well, that's pretty good, actually. You know. But what about a year later? So this is a year later after, you know, the PPE policy came into place, after these unannounced inspections. We're now up to 76% of lab groups being 100% compliant. So if there was one mess up in the PPE findings, then, you know, that lab group has got a black mark against them for everything that they do.
Now, these inspections had a slightly broad definition of what was non-compliant. So probably more than 76% of labs are actually compliant when it came to PPE. So if we focus on PPE, some of the results are shown here.
Right. So in this graph, it shows the findings, non-compliant findings from 2010, focusing on shoes, pants, gloves, eye protection, and lab coats. There were 70 findings from 183 lab groups. Okay, a year later, it went down to 7. I mean, it's just a huge increase in compliant, real compliant behavior. So this, the combination of the PPE policy and the unannounced inspections just had a huge impact across the science part of campus on people's behavior and what they're wearing in the lab. Just, it's really quite amazing. Okay, so where are we today? As of June 2012, our compliance is nearing 90% with 284 lab groups inspected.
So we think that this is a very high level of compliance and good diligence on the part of the researchers.
Okay, what about punishments? Okay, so we have this policy, and several of my colleagues will say to me, I don't care, I'm not doing this. So what do we do about that? So something that is under discussion by the Lab Safety Committee is a 3 strikes policy. This has not gone into place yet. It's very controversial. What we're looking at is failure to correct safety violations result in a series of strikes. 1 strike will result in a special notice to the PI. 2 strikes, and this is in the aftermath of an inspection, will require the PI to provide a written explanation for the failure to correct any violations and appear before the Lab Safety Committee to discuss a corrective action plan. 3 strikes can result in a shutdown of the lab for 5 days or more, and until the corrective action is taken place, and the lab will be shut down by the Vice Chancellor for Research, and an opening of the lab requires corrective actions.
So we haven't instituted this yet, but it would be a very huge change in the way faculty are treated, because faculty are rarely, if ever, given punishments for bad behavior. So we'll see how this plays out.
Right.
So the last 2 items here is just expectations and compliance, and we just want to point out how important it is that if you set expectations, then you will get compliance. And so we mentioned already that the faculty are treated as managers, and they have a list of expectations and duties on them. And so this is from our laboratory safety manual. It's important to remind faculty of their responsibilities, but they are taking this seriously. So as 2 examples here, Professor Maynard wrote in an email, I do an inspection of my labs every Monday afternoon. I also had to change my lab group's safety officer because he was not aggressive enough. Professor Garcia-Garibay solved that last problem in a different way. So he said, in my research group, everyone was mad at the lab safety officer because apparently that person was being too aggressive. So then what Professor Garcia-Garibay did was each person in the lab group is required to be this lab safety officer twice a month, and for those 2 days, complete 2 inspections a day. And so this spreads out the responsibilities among the students so that they all get to be the safety monitors for the lab. So what has the student response been? The students' response has been fantastic. So really the students have been really good about wearing their PPE and instituting new safety policies. They have had dramatic increases in training, initial, annual, and ongoing training. We have increased expectations on the students and researchers, increased responsibilities on them. So one example of that is that each laboratory group has a lab safety officer from amongst the postdocs and grad students or staff researchers, and they are responsible for self-inspections, and they're a point of contact for our H&S. But the students really are the front line for the implementation of safety practices. So you can see in our cartoon here that 2 out of 3 have it right, and the 2 are actually responsible for making sure that the 3rd person does get it right. What has been the outcome? So looking at pictures from 2002 versus 2012. So 2002, Brandon from Michigan is wearing the standard lab attire of the T-shirt, but now we have researchers wearing all the time either the white lab coats or the blue flame-resistant laboratory coats, which you actually have monogrammed for UCLA Department of Chemistry and Biochemistry.
But we have ongoing challenges. We need to implement consistent PPE standards across the campus. We need clear and explicit rules and expectations. It's very difficult to get the word out. We send off emails, and they often end up in the trash. I go out and talk to faculty groups, but not everybody comes to the meetings, so on and so forth. We need PPE standards based on hazard assessments. Our laboratory hazard assessment tool is really helpful in that. But there's a huge challenge in that the Cal OSHA regulations really were developed for industry. And academics, at least in the biomedical and life sciences, we're using very, very small amounts, okay, of hazards. And we're getting a lot of pushback from faculty who say, this makes no sense. You know, this is really, you know, these PPE and other lab safety policies are really meant for industrial-sized amounts of hazards and not for what we use in my laboratory. And we haven't really come to a good response for that.
Yeah. A good example of that is SOPs. SOPs are fine if you have a production facility making the same widget every single day of the year. But in academic labs, we're doing research. We're always doing things different every single day. And so to think about writing SOPs is very difficult. And so we can have general SOPs with PPE recommendations, but it's really hard to have specific things in analogy to industry. Well, I think we're about out of time, so we should probably wrap this up. Our conclusions. So academic lab use of PPE can change quickly. We've demonstrated that within a relatively short period of time, we can see dramatic changes in the behavior of researchers and the behavior of PIs. We want to point out that PPE expectations can lead to PPE compliance, and compliance leads to a culture of safety, which is really our ultimate goal here in academic institutions. So to wrap it up, we just want to thank Professor Ken Bradley, who's the chair of the UCLA Laboratory Safety Committee, Dr. James Gibson, who's been tireless in his promotion of safety at UCLA as the director of the UCLA Office of Environment, Health, and Safety, and then finally Professor James Economou, who's the Vice Chancellor for Research.
Okay, thank you very much for your attention. We'll take any questions.
There's a number of questions that have been asked on the poll here. If I could read them to you, maybe you can address them to the crowd here. I'll just take them in chronological order here. The first question is, does laboratory in your policy, does laboratory include art studios and other places where flammable and corrosive chemicals are used?
Yes, it does. So we have an art studio that is not on the UCLA campus. It's in Culver City, which is about 10 miles, I guess. 5 to 10 miles. Yeah, whatever. It's a 30-minute drive no matter what you do around here. So it's off campus, and they get inspected. And the first time EH&S inspected our art studio, it was an absolute mess. I mean, it's just disastrous. And so now they're in compliance with lab safety standards.
A lot of solvents used in art are highly flammable, dangerous materials.
What are the impacts to non-chemistry labs, such as electronics labs or field work? Have you had much interaction or feedback from those labs?
Yes, I have actually gone out and met at faculty meetings with every single department on campus that works with any type of hazard. So, you know, with electrical engineering, chemical engineering, they have hazards, and they do get inspected. They have to comply with the regulations that are specific for the types of research that they do. We're currently, the entire UC system is grappling with what to do about field studies. It's a work in progress. So especially with the outbreak of the virus coming from mouse droppings that were, so you know, people are more aware that, you know, trekking around out in, you know, the woods, the desert, you know, you can encounter perhaps even more hazards than you do in your own laboratory. So, but that's a work in progress.
I was at a safety conference 2 weeks ago, and one of the key things that came up was that chemists know a lot about the hazards of the materials they're working with. So really some of the challenges are educating the non-chemists about the hazards they're encountering with the things that they're using. So for example, it was mentioned art. Well, if artists are using solvents, they're highly flammable materials, and so they need to take precautions in using those, and maybe they're not so aware because they're not specialists in chemistry.
And that goes true for the biomedical and life sciences. We have a lot of chemicals in our lab, and we know what they do in terms of the response of biological systems, but not the impact necessarily that they have on the human doing the research.
Okay. A couple other questions came up about students. Let me combine a couple of these. What about students who are doing research for credits? Are they included in your policy? And what about students in laboratory classes?
So any undergraduate students doing undergraduate research in research labs are held to the same standards. So all the research labs are covered by these policies.
And it's true for volunteers, high school students. We have, thousands of students that are in our laboratories, especially in the medical school. They want to get into medical school, and so that the way that they feel that, that they'll get a leg up is by working in a laboratory. They're held to exactly the same standards.
So in the teaching laboratories, these rules are not immediately applicable to that. However, we have a responsibility to make sure that the teaching labs have a high degree of safety. And so in the chemistry labs in my department, the undergraduate students in their lab classes actually are now wearing the blue flame-resistant laboratory coats as the standard requirement for the laboratory course. Now, those lab coats are required that the students buy them because it's part of the course materials that they're using.
Okay. Another commenter asks whether or not you allow clean areas in labs, areas in which the eating or ingestion of food or comestibles might be allowed.
No, our EH&S policy requires that food and drink are outside of laboratory areas, and this is extremely difficult, just such a messy problem because the modern laboratories, the desks are right in the lab there, so what do? Oftentimes, at least in the type of research that goes on in my laboratory, you have to babysit. You have to be on top of your experiment for 12 hours straight. You've barely got time to go to the bathroom. So it makes it very challenging. You really can't set up a table out in the hallway because then that breaks, the fire marshal law. So it's a really difficult issue, but no food and drink in the lab, no such thing as a clean area unless there is a door separating you, who's doing the eating and drinking, from the laboratory.
Yeah, so in chemistry here we have labs designed so that there's the lab area and then a separate room attached with a glass wall between them, and that's the office area where students can eat and drink there.
Okay. There's a comment here that says, I agree that EH&S as COPS is counterproductive. What do you recommend as a change?
So say that again.
COPS
is counterproductive.
Yeah, do you have any recommendations as to how to create a very productive partnership or relationship with EH&S?
So you can actually, take, there's an easy analogy, and that's the LAPD. So the LAPD had a horrible, horrible reputation here in Los Angeles. And what they ended up doing was moving to a community policing mode where they went out often and early, and they talked with the community, established a relationship. And so I think that same type of thing can be done with EH&S. They need to go out often to visit the PIs and the research staff. They need to establish a relationship with them to get the buy-in and the respect, and then they can help educate the researchers. And with all those types of activities, then the researchers will not push back as much.
Right. We've seen in the past year and a half, a huge improvement in the relationship between the inspectors and the PIs and researchers. And this was something that was directed training of the inspectors and how to interact with querulous PIs, let's say. Not every PI is nice and sweet like Craig and I are when we have an inspector come into the lab. And so so our inspectors are being taught to be respectful when they come into the laboratory. You're coming into someone's home away from home. To use the inspection as a teachable moment or a prolonged teachable moment. It's a really important job of the inspector is to instruct, and also for them to at least appear to be interested in the research that's going on in the laboratory. Researchers love to talk about their own work. And so although it takes more time, that effort is really paid off. And I'm getting feedback really for the first time that how helpful the inspectors are, during these inspections, how nice they were, how respectful they were. So that really pays off a lot.
And also, I mentioned that at UCLA they've been working on hiring inspectors that have PhD degrees in the subject areas such as chemistry and biochemistry. And given the horrible economy, it's really easy to get good people.
I agree.
Very good points. Another commenter asked the question, when you as a principal investigator, when you witness students or lab staff not complying with the PPE policy, how do you handle those situations of noncompliance?
Immediately.
Yeah.
With firm resolve.
Right. So I actually don't have any students right now in my laboratory other than undergraduates, and they do everything that they're told. It's the problem had been in the past with my longtime researchers who had been doing research for 15, 20 years or more. It took them a longer time to get on board, and I was firm. They were in compliance when I was in the lab, and they knew I would be in the lab. They were not in compliance when they thought that they knew that I wouldn't be in the lab. And then finally, what I told them was that if they are not in compliance, then it would be written up in their annual report.
Yeah. It really is up to the PI to set the expectations for the lab. And once it's done, then people comply. Like safety glasses, everyone has worn safety glasses for a long time in chemistry, and it's the norm. And so it just takes a little bit of time to set the expectations regarding other types of PPE, and then the researchers comply.
Another question here is, do you have a policy that covers maintenance, facility, or custodial workers who enter laboratories?
Yeah, that's an important point. So we sort of agonized about that because the custodians are coming into all the labs. What we have done is we have not required them to wear PPE that is of the type that the researchers are wearing, because they actually are not working with the laboratory materials. They're generally passing through, sweeping or collecting the refuse.
Right. That's very different than the anybody at all, including custodial workers, first responders that would come into a BSL-3 facility. They are trained by the director of high containment facilities.
Okay, you mentioned that PPE is free for employees by regulations, but noted that UCLA purchased bulk quantities of lab coats to sell. Were those lab coats sold to individuals or departments?
So my department, chemistry and biochemistry, bought several hundred flame-resistant laboratory coats, and then we sell it to our stock room. And basically, researchers go to the stock room and they use their accounts to buy those, and those are off grant accounts. Those are grant accounts.
Right. So it doesn't come out of pocket. It comes out of it's a lab supply.
I was going to mention that system-wide purchasing is trying to establish some system-wide contracts for very good pricing, for negotiated prices for both regular white lab coats and for FR-rated lab coats, as well as laundering. And so more information for those on the phone can be found from your local EH&S department or your local procurement office.
Okay.
Another question that came up here was the last bulleted point you said was driving the change in safety culture was via compliance. Has any effort been given to creating compliance via culture change or student buy-in?
Yeah. The students, they know what happened, and so they seem to have accepted the change in culture here. They do police each other. We also note that people have considered incentives like EH&S giving awards or prizes to the labs that have the most compliance. But really, with hundreds and hundreds of labs on campus, I'm not convinced that that's the way to go. But it seems like change their culture.
Yeah, so things are a little bit different in the medical school where we have far fewer students, and the researchers, the primary researchers are postdoctoral fellows. The postdoctoral fellows, 60% of them are from foreign countries where they have a very poor standard of lab safety. And so getting them on board, getting them trained, it's a real challenge.
Yeah, but if you're a new researcher to a lab, if you walk in and everyone is wearing PPE, then it just becomes clear that that's the expectation. But I will admit that in programs that have graduate students who stay 4 or 5, 6 years, it really helps having that continuity of expertise.
Right. And I'll just give you an example from my own laboratory. I had a prospective postdoc and I told her when she was coming that she had to bring long pants and closed-toed shoes. And what she brought were mini skirts and boots. Of separation than for working with a small amount of hydrochloric acid. So right now it's being left up to the PI to make that assessment, and I think that is the correct way to go.
One rule we use here at UCLA is called the LA Times test, and that means that if you would want to have your protocol splashed over the headlines of the Los Angeles Times, most people probably wouldn't want that. So if you're going to pass the Times test, they're not going to write a story about you, then it's probably okay.
Okay, and 2 quick last questions here. One of those, another commenter mentions that with the adoption of the global harmonized standard, a new definition of flammable will extend to substances with a flash point up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or I believe it's 93 degrees Celsius. What are your thoughts about how the UCLA policy will address that?
So with the current definition of flammable, which is 100 degrees Fahrenheit, that includes methanol and ethanol and propanol, isopropanol. It includes standard solvents like toluene, benzene, ether, ethyl acetate, hexanes. And so there's a pretty broad variety of solvents that are covered with that. If the change to the global harmonized system raises that a little bit, and that's not a big change going from 100 Fahrenheit to 140 Fahrenheit would raise it to about 100, it's significantly higher. That would encompass more chemicals, but not. I don't think it's going to have that big of an impact because I think it might capture butanol and pentanol, but those are not used very much at all. So I don't think it's going to have a big problem. But as I said, in chemistry, we threw away the white lab coats and we just used the flame-resistant lab coats. In the life science areas, they're principally using, say, ethanol for sterilization, and so that change is not going to impact them either.
Okay. And then one last question here is UCLA pursuing any way to tie compliance of laboratory safety into a performance evaluation of a principal investigator?
Well, we've discussed it. It's not something that has been implemented. So I do it in my laboratory, but it was a way of getting people to be compliant more readily. Long-time researchers who were having a hard time shifting their behavior. So I use it in my laboratory. I think it's actually a really good tool to use for PIs, but it's not a policy.
Yeah, and for promotion, tenure and promotion actions on faculty, it's safety. If someone had a very unsafe lab, it might come up. But if they have small violations, I doubt it would impact tenure and promotion.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That's all the questions that we have listed and presented here in the group. So I would like to thank you both very much for just an excellent presentation. I think that kind of gave us a firsthand account of the challenges that I believe all the universities are going to be facing as each campus begins to implement their policies and requirements for personal protective equipment. So thank you both for today's presentation.
Hey, you're welcome.
You're welcome.